Hello and welcome to Solving Climate Change Once and for All. I'm Bi Huye, and thank you so much for joining this online series where we're talking to experts and entrepreneurs to learn what from their work we can apply to climate action and, more importantly, to climate justice. You'll leave with the one key thing you can do to make a positive impact. My question for you today is, are you ready to myth bust? We're going to expose the dirty secrets of recycling with a waste expert and entrepreneur who's helping small businesses and institutions aspire to that holy grail of zero waste. Hello and welcome, Rachana Shah.
Hi, so happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. Tell us about the day when you started your work in environmental sustainability. What was kind of that tipping point or points that motivated you to switch from your steady career in consulting to this subject matter?
So I started out in IT consulting and IT business analysis, and I was definitely very comfortable in my life. I was even challenged by my work, but however, I had taken a small sabbatical in between my work where I had gone to Brazil to volunteer and teach English to children in a slum in Brazil and in Rio de Janeiro. And I came back from that, and I went back to my IT work, and it took me a few years to kind of internalize that even though I was comfortable and challenged and so lucky and blessed to have both of those things, that I was actually happiest when I was there interacting with children, helping enrich their lives. And so I realized that I wanted a more purpose-driven life. I wanted to be able to have an impact. And also I tried to think back to the times that made me happiest and in terms of giving back. And that's when I had done adopted trails and beach cleanups as a middle schooler and a high schooler. And that feeling of leaving the world a better place than it was just an hour before or a few hours before that. And it's just such a tactile and simple way to give back. But I realized that these few experiences brought me much more joy than the typical measures of success for adults sometimes. And so I took a step back and realized I wanted to get into this fight, this kind of movement to create a better world. And so I went back to graduate school to get a master's in environmental sustainability. And that's where I met people who wanted to make a difference in so many different realms of the problem. I mean, my passion was always waste reduction or the elimination of waste, but I met people who were so interested in energy systems, in policy. They were total policy wonks. There was landscape architecture and landscape ecology, people who were just so interested in the different species that matched and that helped solve certain problems, and food systems, retail, just you name it. And it just really made me feel like I felt like an Avenger, and we're all going to go into the real world and tackle these different problems. And kind of, I had that solidarity and optimism that we were going to be able to actually move the needle and make a difference.
I love that journey, and I love this Avengers sort of spring of hope that it's not you alone, but you and your particular interest and passion with all these other people and their particular passion and interest is what is going to move the needle. So thanks for sharing that story. It's awesome. Let's jump right into unpacking the myths and buzz around recycling. I think we know, and for those who don't know yet, that companies like Coca-Cola and the Dixie Cup company all the way back in the 50s, rather than changing their materials and operations to be more sustainable, they basically have created our addiction to single-use plastic and that consumption. And through some brilliant marketing work, really with awful implications for the environment, effectively transferred this onus and burden to individuals, right? Everybody can recycle. If you don't, you're a litter bug. rather than the industries that have access to resources and really could have changed that up front, making that change. So what do you make of all of this? You know, there's a lot of buzz around, is recycling working? Is it effective? How does it kind of affect your perspective on all of that?
Well, I love your question because you're absolutely right. Um, this could have been something that from the very beginning was just designed in such a way that waste wasn't the byproduct of enjoying this product. And yet we just didn't have that kind of forward thinking at the time, and or even during the process. And unfortunately, that's led us to the problem we're in, as you mentioned. Um, it's it kind of informs something I've been thinking a lot of lately, which is the small actions you can do to help change the overall system,
Mhm.
or the supplier side responsibility is just as important, if not more, than the small actions you can do on the consumer side or on the individual side.
Mhm.
Uh, so, what I mean by that is we can all feel a lot of guilt for not recycling or composting or doing certain things that we think will make the world a better place. But one week where you couldn't sort through all your trash in the way you wanted to, or do whatever eco-friendly action you wanted to take. But that week you wrote an email, or you tweeted to a company and said, tweeted a picture saying, why do I have this much packaging for this small little product,
Mhm.
right? Or why is your packaging not recyclable? Right? A simple
Mhm.
question. Um, or what if you educated yourself that there was a fracking pipeline that was going to pass through your city, and what kind of implications that would have to your drinking water, or your neighbors' drinking water, or
Mhm.
any such. And so you either wrote to your elected representative, or you signed a petition. I mean, there's just so many ways that we can educate ourselves onto how the environmental problem is just so multifaceted, and there's just so many different things we can do. And you're right, if we try to shift the responsibility back onto the suppliers just as much as we take responsibility onto ourselves, I think
Mhm.
all really make a bigger impact overall, and also just reduce that amount of guilt that we're feeling, because it's really about changing the system, as you exactly said.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a really helpful framework to think about the supplier side and the consumer side. And so much is imbalanced and focused on the consumer side, which creates that guilt, which then we all have to contend with and kind of struggle with. But if you can channel that energy back to, hey, on the supplier side, there's a lot that needs to happen here. That's an awesome sort of tip for people to
Yeah.
take away.
Yeah, and I think like the more, especially when it comes to corporations, the more um, they're getting attention to packaging issues or waste, they really do actually respond. Um, they respond to those things, and it's just a matter of making your voice heard. It's really important.
hmm And I think you mentioned to me how in this time of recording during the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing a lot of that happen, right? With companies that are responding in a time of crisis because it's so tangible and in front of us. So, how quickly we can adapt.
Yeah. I mean, this period of of life with this pandemic that's been happening, this unprecedented time, has opened my eyes in such a big way as to how quickly human behavior change can actually happen. I mean, what I studied was human behavior change, and recycling has a lot to do with behavior change. And so I think about this a lot. And I mean, granted, so the biggest difference with the pandemic and the climate crisis is the effects are pretty immediate with the pandemic. And unlike with the environmental crisis, it's very delayed. The consequences are very delayed. So that's one of the biggest struggles we have in trying to get people to change behaviors, because it's hard to connect the dots between the consequence of your action and your action.
hmm
However, this is this pandemic has shown me that these effects are happening, but a lot of them are science based, and so people are really resonating with trying to understand the science
Mm-hmm.
and change their behaviors, and realizing that changing your behaviors, in the case of the pandemic, flattens the curve. And so, if this can happen, I mean, granted, it would not be as quick, or I wouldn't expect it to be as quick for the environmental crisis. However, this just gives me more hope than I've ever had in a in a different way. It gives me more hope than I've ever had that this kind of like mass human behavior change is actually possible, and
Mm-hmm.
will possibly be embraced by people because they will understand consequences do kind of add up, and unfortunately, in the cost of human lives and human health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's such an important parallel you're drawing. And I've talked a little bit about with some friends, these COVID-19 goggles that we're all putting on. What do we retain from that as
Yeah,
we move forward and think about the way that we live? And to your point, the behavioral change that we can make when we are pressed to do so.
exactly.
So, bottom line, is recycling worthwhile?
Definitely yes. Definitely yes. However, we have to think about the how. And so I'll say, the effectiveness of recycling over time changes. It used to be about double the amount that we recycled, and by what I mean by what we recycled is how much of what you're putting in your blue bin, or what we as a society and a nation put in our collective blue bins, how much of that is actually being turned into new products.
Right.
That unfortunately, that percentage has gone down by almost half.
Mm.
But so that's discouraging, right? Uh, but I look at it, recycling, as creating the habit and the discipline around an action that actually, and I think recycling is like a gateway action into other really good and
Mm.
beneficial environmental actions. But creating a good habit is really just, it's something that we need to tie to, I mean, why do we try to watch less TV or spend less money, or any kind of good habit that we try to incorporate into our lives? It's because that habit is tied to a value that we cherish, and a
Mhm.
better quality of life that we want. And so in this case, in the case of recycling, we are kind of prioritizing a future need over an immediate need. The immediate need to not care about, and not the immediate need to, I don't want to sort, I don't want to have to like find out another bin, or all those little kind of details, but you're prioritizing your future need of a clean and livable planet
Mm.
uh, over that one. And that kind of impulse control in your brain actually rewires it, and it actually brings about happiness in much the same way that saving money does, or losing weight after changing your diet, and all those things. Um, so yes, so I just believe that when we create those habits, we're just actually creating a better and um, better way of thinking, a better mindset.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but then I say the how matters, because um, we don't need to be really going so over the top about doing these things, because like I just said, if we kind of look at it as a more like, I'm going to spend this much brain power or time on recycling because I want to spend some other brain power and time educating myself on other issues. It's just a more holistic way to look at it. And it just goes back to something else I said, which is uh, we don't need to guilt ourselves or shame ourselves into, oh, I just didn't do it perfectly, or I didn't do it well this one week. But that's okay. We we just need to do our best. The current rate of recycling is about 5%, and
Wow.
yeah, 5%. It doesn't seem like a lot, but Americans generate more waste than any other country per person, than any other country out there, and so
Mhm.
5%, it matters.
Mhm.
I would for, I would do it for less than that. So And, you know, really we just need to be, and that's another thing, that's another great thing that you can talk to your local representatives and have them bring it up the chain, about, hey, why aren't these numbers bigger? Why don't we have better recycling infrastructure?
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe how can we bring it into our community and create jobs even that way? So there's just a lot we can talk about, and think that the act and habit of recycling will kind of uh, inspire all these other thoughts. And so it's still always worth it. And I should just mention that in the how part, that most of us know, I think, that you should send clean recyclables to the recycling facility. They don't accept things that have caked on food.
Mm-hmm.
But water scarcity is probably one of the biggest of all of the problems, is one of the biggest problems. And just because everyone needs water to drink, that we don't need to use so much water to clean these things out. So that's just like, it's something if we educate ourselves on that issue, then we also just are spending less of our time because we know what's most important. It's a kind of good way to prioritize the different issues and save yourself a little bit of time too.
Yeah, definitely. There's so much in there that's so helpful in terms of figuring out what we can do, how to do it well, and to not be ashamed of feeling like it's too small of an impact, because some is better than none. And to your point, that habit that you're building and connecting the action to the larger positive cause, that is really empowering. So I love that. And I think what you've touched on now a couple of times is this puzzling part of sustainability and general climate action, dealing with shame, right? That we've talked about those awkward moments when your friends guiltily look at you as they're throwing away their rubbish. Like, am I doing this right? Or personally, when I think about my lifestyle and the ways that I could diminish my carbon footprint, make my diet more plant-based, all the things that we kind of know as individuals we've sort of talked about that do make a difference. It's a balance that's hard to strike, right? You don't want to be crippled by the aspirations to be perfect, like you said, but you're striving to be a role model. You're striving to make as much positive impact as possible. So how do you contend with that dynamic? And what can you share for our listeners who I'm sure are struggling with the same?
I used to be pretty hard on myself too about what I didn't do. Um, I just realized that guilt and shame are not productive. So instead
Mhm.
of the guilt or shame motivating me um, to do more, it actually just made me feel bad and kind of maybe for a short time crawl into a shell, until I was able to shake that off and say, oh, you know what? It's fine. I did the best I could. But I just realized that after that happened multiple times, that this feeling wasn't helpful, wasn't productive.
Mhm.
Um, I now just, I really, I mean, my biggest advice to anybody who's trying to do their best, which I think is awesome, is just use yourself as a benchmark. And I think we just need to be laser focused on saying, am I better than what I was a week ago or a month ago? Or I like to use a quarter ago,
Mhm.
or, so like the changes I've incorporated this spring, was that better than what I did last winter or last quarter? And I say that because, I think, not every change is going to happen in the very next week, but so let's say the environment, the behavior change you'd like to incorporate is to have a reusable coffee cup. I mean, I know now we live in a different world temporarily, hopefully. But that was one of the first changes I made. And I remember how hard it was at first, but once you just do it and I mean, there's just such a sense of pride.
Yeah.
Uh, like, hey, that was actually easy. Sure, I slipped up 10 times, 20 times, but eventually I got it. And now it's second nature, right? And we have to allow ourselves, I mean, it's part of brain elasticity to fail, so that we can learn and just try to get better. So I would just say to anybody watching, just use yourself as a benchmark, and just, if you've done better than you did a quarter ago or a week ago or a year ago, whatever your benchmark is, then you're doing great. And there's always up to go from there, because even the most environmentally conscious or the most politically active or the most off the grid person always has things that they would like to be doing better. And so good, we should all just try to strive to be better. That's all we can really hope for, without any guilt just shaming us and making us feel worse.
That's such an awesome message. And I think it really helps me personally in thinking about how do you flip that feeling on its head and channel it to something more productive and be easier on yourself, because the work that we're doing is hard, it's constant, it's all around us, right? In terms of the different entry points, to your point about looking at all of your grad school friends and all the ways that we can make a difference, right? So that's an awesome piece of advice. So, the core of this series is dedicated to an often overlooked topic in the climate change dialogue, which is climate justice. I'm curious what that means to you, and why you think it's so easily ignored.
So when I first, so I graduated from grad school in 2012. When I first graduated, I would use, I would tell people when I'm trying to educate them, and we really need to care about climate change. The climate is changing, these are the reasons why. And, people heard me, but I don't think that, that summarization, climate change, really communicated to them that this was urgent. So then a few years later, the term climate crisis kind of was being used more. And I was happy because I was able to communicate the fact that it was a crisis much more easily to people, because it's in the title.
Yeah.
But then it kind of still allowed people to feel disassociated from the consequences of the climate crisis. And I just think that human piece was always missing, because often the consequences are felt by people in faraway places, and in ways that are not on our front pages of our newspapers. So I just struggled once again with how to communicate this problem. And then this term of climate justice came up. And I mean, I think it can be used for so many groups to highlight the injustices felt by the climate crisis. And one example could be all non-human species, right? I mean, that's just one sense of injustice, because they cannot advocate for themselves, So when there's deforestation happening and natural habitat loss and all these things to clear way for things that we use as humans, and we kind of use our domination as a species. So I look at that. That's one way to say climate justice, right? But there's so many communities, marginalized communities, and it's often the poorest of the poor who have to live in low-lying places, drought-prone places, just the places that are really affected in the worst ways, flood-prone. Those are the people that bear the brunt of this.
Mm-hmm.
And often those are the people that have the least carbon footprint. And so really, climate justice, when that term started being used more, it really resonated to me, because it just encapsulates all of the social and environmental justice issues that I first learned in graduate school, but in just one phrase. So to me, that's one of the most powerful statements to say climate justice now. I mean, we need it now. People are experiencing it now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that is a reason why bringing out the human impacts, but also the human power in what we can do in the context of climate crisis, climate justice is an interesting balance, right? We're part of the problem, we can be part of the solution, and it is a human problem. It's not just based on a changing global temperature and sea rise level, et cetera. I'm,
Yes.
I'm curious, throughout the course of your work, your studies, what's the most shocking thing you've learned as related to climate justice or your work in zero waste?
So aside from like, any small anecdotal like surprise things that have happened, I actually really what sticks out in my mind is so there's a notion of carbon footprint of people in every country. And I learned early on that Americans
Mhm.
are have the largest carbon footprint of any country per person. Now, some people might know that, but they might not know what that means. What it shows is that actually Americans commit a lot more carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases per person than people from any other country by far, by
Mhm.
far. So um, there are as I was saying earlier, the people who are bearing the hardest brunt of these climate consequences are the ones whose footprint is very, very, very little compared to ours.
Right.
And so, I mean, to me, I just find it very shocking that we just don't know this. It's not in our collective conscience as a country. And so, basically, I just I just wish that we would have more like personal responsibility and like societal responsibility and say, okay, there's this problem
Mhm.
confirmed by science, and we are actually, as Americans, contributing the most to this than any other country.
Mhm.
What do we, what should we now give back because of this? Or what should we internalize and change because of this? I mean, it's just the discrepancy is so wide that I often really struggle with the fact that most people don't really even know this. So to me, that's the most shocking thing. And what that's going to mean in terms of consequences is 20 million or more climate refugees. Um,
Wow.
yeah, I mean, considering the stances some countries have taken on immigration, it's what responsibility do we have to these people? I mean, we have to really think about if we caused this problem, then at the very least, should we not consider accepting some of these refugees? There's people who have lost their entire livelihoods, like a lot of fishermen, a lot of people in fishing coastal towns that have lost their complete livelihood. And so we have to really, put ourselves in their shoes and think, I mean, I know they're like thousands and upon thousands of miles away from us, but what would you do if you suddenly lost your entire livelihood, were worried about supporting your family, and then you had to pick up and you had to move somewhere else where there's also competing lack of resources? And this is basically what's been happening all over the world already. It's already happening, and it's causing a lot of political instability, and that has reverberations all around the world. And so it's not just, we're not shielded from it like we think we are. So
Mhm.
there's that kind of like the dots are not being connected by and I mean, this is something where media and politicians, people of influence can try to help, but also the people have to be open to hearing it as well. So there's just a lot of missing pieces that it still shocks me to this day, honestly.
Definitely. I mean, that's a staggering number to think about, and it's very, very real. We've felt it already because of this global pandemic, and I think other crises that are creating refugees around the world. But this will be like COVID-19, the great equalizer where you can't escape from it, right? And so
Yeah.
that that gap between what we do every day and what will happen in the future and the connection that we hope to create through these daily actions, whether it's recycling or some other entry point, whatever makes sense for each individual. Hopefully we can strengthen that and build that bridge together.
Connecting local to global, just like you've mentioned. Yep.
Right. So given that sort of staggering realization, where do you derive hope?
Hmm. I read somewhere that if you're feeling hopeless, just go to a climate rally and you'll be fine. And that's completely true. I couldn't agree with it more. Unfortunately, we can't really do those right now. And I know they're not everyone's cup of tea. However, if you ever do, once this is over, if anyone ever has any interest in just, you don't have to be right on the front lines. You could just kind of be in the background and watch, but it's really the biggest sense of optimism I've ever gotten. The latest one, because they're all youth led now. So you see a lot of youth, and it's really remarkable how passionate today's youth are about this problem. So going to a rally is definitely number one. And I should mention, since we can't go to them right now, what's kind of more easier or accessible is digital protest and digital activism. And some people don't think that works, but it does work. Mm-hmm. And it's really great because maybe if you physically couldn't get to a protest you wanted to go to, or if you didn't have time, now it's a lot easier to be involved in protests. So I encourage you to log on to join movements like 350.org or Sunrise Movement or any of these movements that really are galvanizing people power, and figure out what they're doing now during the pandemic, because likely maybe it's something that's easier to participate in than going to a physical rally. So that's just one. But spending time in nature is always a cure. I mean, it's like scientifically proven to cure to cure most mental ailments, and I fully believe that, and I've seen that happen to me and my mood. Going outside and just seeing how resilient nature, animals, and plants are against crazy conditions is just very inspiring. And also just being around art and creativity. These things really help us reckon kind of these emotions of sometimes helplessness and feel like, oh, I'm doing my part, but it's not enough. But if you actually viewing other artists who are expressing that emotion, it is enough, and there is so much solidarity in the movement. It's really inspiring. And the people I mentioned in the beginning who I went to school with, who are kind of doing their work, and even if I'm feeling down, if I call almost any of one of them up and say, how's it going in your work? Even if they say, oh, I wish I could do more. Even if they say that, which some don't, some say I'm doing a lot and it's working. Mm-hmm. But even the ones that say, oh, I wish I could do more, are saying, however, I am seeing over the last 5 years, attitudes are changing and things are getting better. So it really always pulls me out of it. So if not, friends of yours, but there are a lot of environmental leaders that are on social media, and you can hear their stories and see that, people are waking up to the fact that we need to make big changes. So it's happening. We should all feel happy about that.
Yeah, and I love that sort of litany of things that allow you to find inspiration again, whether it's community, creativity, art, nature, activism. I mean, there's so much there. I think you also mentioned to me your secret weapon that you might want to share with our audience.
That's right. Well, I work with kids at schools trying to help them go zero waste. I've dealt with a lot of adults who come with a lot of preconceived notions. Oh, but this is not possible. That's like the first thing I hear, but it's not possible. Make that change. And then you go and you talk to kids, and there is none of that. And the kind of matter of factness they bring to the table in terms of solving the problem, like, oh, we can't recycle that, why don't we just put another bin, we'll do it. Okay, like, it's just very, like, it's a simplified way of thinking that eliminates a lot of that useless adult preconceived notions. So I say kids are my secret weapon, because if the students are clamoring for something, then the principal listens more than even if parents are. And if children go home and talk to their parents, I know that makes a much bigger difference than me telling from parent to parent. So I I think everyone can agree that that innocence of looking at the world is what we need more of, and that idealism. And I'm sick to death of people telling me, but that's not how it works. But because we can change the world how we think it should be, if we all just agree and get behind it, then we can do it. There should be no obstacles in the sense of, well, this is how it was never done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think there's incredible work you've done with kids, but also with different social constructs, right? So for our listeners, the work you did in India with Untouchables and teaching them how to recycle, giving them a means of livelihood at the same time that you're introducing this sustainable way of living and dealing with waste. What has that sort of taught you about grassroots um, action? And we promised our listeners kind of the number one thing that they could do to make a positive impact. So what lessons from that experience can you kind of boil down into a takeaway for our audience?
So I did, yes. I worked with an organization in India that helped to educate waste pickers, which were often untouchables. And waste pickers in India are people who are literally picking through the trash to pick out things of value to give to um, another vendor. So often it's recyclables.
Mm-hmm.
They'll pick them out of the trash and collect them, clean them if need be, and get it to the recycling person so that they can earn an income from that.
Mm-hmm.
We were on a mission to teach them how to also segregate organic waste, so they can and send it to a facility that we had helped set up, and then that could be turned into compost and sold to farmers, and then the wages could come back to the waste pickers. I remember just talking to them, and one thing I've brought from my consulting background, and I think just from the way I was raised, is treating everyone as equals. And so even though I'm Indian, but the thought of an untouchable is like just something I don't even still understand it, to be honest. And so I remember one of them had talked to me a great deal about and I was researching, and at the end of I was just so taken by her and her positive attitude towards her work. And at the end of, I thanked her and I gave her a hug. And she kind of just looked at me like with big eyes, like, wow, I can't believe, you gave me a hug. And just that human connection it's really powerful. It kind of, like, why are we so disconnected from the people that clean up after us sometimes? And
Mm-hmm.
often work I do especially in the minute I get into an institution like a school, I immediately try to befriend the janitorial staff and the custodial staff, because these are the people, and they often want to see the same changes that we often have the same goals. They don't want to see all this trash. They see it in front of their very eyes. And, it's just interesting how you can really galvanize a movement and see how everyone's on the same page, even if on paper, in theory, you can say that everyone's on different pages. Oh, and that's not going to matter to them. But no, really, that's not true. So anyway, to go back to your question, since the coronavirus has come, something I say to people a lot has been easier to communicate, so I'll just say it now. When people say the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, um, I I don't think everyone knows how important the first two are as compared to the third. So in other words, reduce, reuse are such more effective ways to help the environmental movement than recycle. So recycling is still worth it, as I talked about it completely and fully believe in it and engage with it. But if we learn to reduce our consumption, reduce the amount that's actually going into any bin total, and learn to reuse our items, we will, as a society, will be better off. And I think in these pandemic times, um, I think we're just naturally reducing how much is coming into our homes and therefore how much is coming out. And also we're learning, I mean, people are picking up renovation projects. They're fixing things rather than buying new things. And I think it's, so instead what I'll say, so that would have been my advice had we not been in the pandemic, but instead I'll say whatever changes that you're just making now in terms of the slowdown and the great pause, as it's been called, if you're able to actually keep some of those behaviors into the post-pandemic world, slowing down. I mean, people are realizing they didn't need everything that they thought they needed. I know a lot of parents that were really sad to not have children's birthday parties, but now we're realizing that it wasn't about the party and really the amount of waste that was created from that party. And it was actually really about doing something different to make the child know, to have the child know how loved they were. So I think we're just right now we're naturally going through a lot of those emotions, and I think just if you can keep it with you and take it with you beyond the pandemic, that will be at least we could have learned something and took it with us beyond all this chaos.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And I think what's super powerful is you're bringing out the class dynamic that's baked into climate justice. And it doesn't mean it's just far away places and developing countries. It's right in our own backyard, right in our own school district, where we might not be looking at janitorial and custodial staff as actors in the solution because of whatever societal construct we've put on that job, that profession, right? So that's a really wonderful story about human connection and how we can challenge our own beliefs. And then tying that back to, as individuals, again, right, focus on reducing and reusing and the creativity that crisis has allowed us to maybe channel
Yeah.
more.
Yes.
So wrapping up, I think I like to ask this question of what is something we're all missing? To your very first point about there's so many different dimensions of this challenge, but also in terms of what we can each bring to it. You have such unique insight and experiences in terms of how you got into the fight and what you're doing now. What do you think we're all kind of missing in the dialogue right now?
I love that question because it's something I think that we all know and it's within us, and it's just a matter of pointing it out. And I think there's a famous meme about it, but it's in one way of thinking. It's a pyramid where humans are on the top and animals are all underneath, and it's called ego. The other one, all the animals and humans are all together in an equal circle, and that one's called eco. And we need to go from an egocentric point of view to an ecocentric point of view. There's something I've been saying a lot lately, which is being selfless is actually selfish and a form of self-love. I say that because, if we as a society and a globe embrace the eco mindset over the ego mindset, we'll see that, okay, I'm going to give you a few examples. If you protect a marsh, you say, I want to protect this ecosystem or a reef or so many of these other ecosystems that are under threat right now. So if you protect a marsh, you're actually setting ourselves, we as humans are setting ourselves up for natural storm protection.
Mm.
If we stop using pesticides because we want to save the bees, we're actually protecting our own food supply. And if we prevent mass deforestation by limiting our consumption of wood and having to clear forests for meat or palm oil or all that. But if we do that, then we actually decrease the likelihood of viruses transferring from animals to humans. So, I mean, I just gave you a few examples, but it is just time after time we find that if we had just allowed a natural ecosystem to flourish and exist, I mean, every species has the right to exist just as much as we do. So if we allow them to exist and have a quality of life that they could have had without our kind of dominating ways, then it's actually back to our own self-interest. So I don't know, if I could tell everybody that, I really would. It's just so important that we change our mindset. The mindset is at the root cause of changing all the behaviors and everything that come along with it.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, I think you've given us a lot to think about and to consider in terms of the myth busting up front, right? Recycling is worth it. And it's more about the way in which we are building habits that allow us to be proud about the action we're taking to create a larger impact. These mindset shifts from ego to eco, and thinking about that in our own self-interest, bridging between what am I doing now in my own sphere that will actually impact and protect me. It's not about giving anything up. It's really about self-preservation, which I think is a big motivator. And then creating that connection back to other humans and thinking about it from this climate justice perspective, right? That it's not so much about the crisis or the change, it's about the human aspect of what are we doing to help other people, and to really make sure that we don't lose that in all of the data and science and deluge of information that we're trying to work through. So really wonderful perspective, amazing work, and excited to support you and see where you go in terms of all of the zero waste initiatives that you're leading. So thanks so much for sharing all of that, Rachana, and I'm sure our listeners will be really eager to put all of this to action in their own lives.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the work you're doing to highlight all these important stories. I couldn't be more proud to be working with you for this. Thank you.